money doesn't grow on trees, all right? How many of us have heard this saying and have been scarred by it? Many millennials have heard this and has led them to have a very negative relationship with their finances. So how do we change the story for the next generation? Our guest today has come here to talk about an abundance money mindset.
Armita is a 16-year-old advocate for financial and economic education for youth. In 2020, she published the book Roadmap to Financial Literacy, an introduction to personal finance for teenagers, and later partnered up with the nonprofit organization Operation Economics International to donate 300 copies of her book to underserved schools in San Marcos, California. Now, if you're interested in starting or even continuing your personal finance journey, then this episode is just for you. Make sure to like the video and click the subscribe button to stay tuned for more. Thank you so much for joining us today, Armita. Now, before we get into the nitty-gritty of financial literacy, I just want to start off by asking what your backstory is and, the type of money messages that were instilled in you as a child.
Yeah, for sure. So I am Iranian Canadian, and so I spent a big part of my life living in Iran, actually most of my life. And I think that growing up, my parents really instilled the value of knowing where your money goes from like a very young age. They were always like teaching me to be like long-term and not spending in the moment, because my parents are like very long-term thinkers and they always want to think into the future as opposed to doing what would satisfy their wants for now. And so seeing that in my family and seeing the way that my parents like cut back and they focused on like long-term things as opposed to short-term wants, whether that be like buying something in a store versus like investing, that was something that really instilled that value and those habits in me. And so I had those good examples in my life, and I started to learn about finance on my own afterwards when I was like near the end of grade 8 before starting grade 9. And I really saw those habits reflected as well as many other ones in what I was learning about finance, because I think that a really big part of financial education is really building those habits and being able to implement those into your life. And that's why learning it from early on is so important, because you're able to know those habits, practice with them, and develop them over time. And so that's kind of how my start started and why I'm so interested in financial education.
Yeah, that's awesome. So when we talk about your journey into financial literacy, you mentioned reading Secrets of the Millionaire Mind, sorry. What about that book stuck out to you at such a young age? And that you mentioned that's what really got you into learning about financial literacy. So was there a specific message about the book that intrigued you?
Yes, I think that the overall message was just about rewiring your mindset to be financially responsible based on developing habits in your life that make you a financially responsible individual. And so for me, that was really interesting, because at the time, especially when you're young, you always hear people talking on social media and like in a lot of different like movies and just like shows, people are always like talking about making a lot of money, being rich, being a millionaire, but they don't really talk about how that's not something that should be externalized. It's more about your internal habits and mindset and what really took you to get there. And so learning that from that book and realizing that it's not about having $1 million in your bank account, but about that thinking that really helps you to save and invest as opposed to spending, and making goals for the future as opposed to just looking very short term. That was the kind of message that I took away from the book. And it kind of juxtaposed with what I was learning as a teenager from like these shows and just everything I was learning online. And so that message was really interesting to me. And I'm really interested in just like psychology, personal development. It's something that I've been interested in since I was like very young. And so that really stuck with me, and it made me interested in continuing to learn more. And another thing that really got me intrigued in the topic of financial education is the talk that there was around it for the lack of it and the demand for it. A lot of people were saying like, we want to learn how to do our taxes. We don't know what credit cards are. And so because I saw that there was this demand for it, but my school didn't have any classes, I was like, hey, let me see what this topic is all about. And so I continued to learn and it eventually got me here. So yeah.
And then you ended up writing a book dedicated to teens about financial literacy, right? So, if you could talk about what sort of topics, money concepts you talk about in your book, An Introduction to Personal Finance, and explain what are the first like primary steps that teens should take to learn about money?
So in my book, my entire approach with it was I was very clear of my target audience because I knew that there was this like huge demand for it among high school students and teenagers in general. And so my goal was to create a single resource that teenagers can come to if they have very little knowledge about finance, and in the end have a holistic understanding of the different elements that go into it. And so I did research on what topics teens need to learn about, what they want to learn about. I asked other high school students, and in the end, I ended up coming up with 4 main chapters that go over a lot of different topics within them. So the first is on building credit and credit cards and why that is so important. The next covers the topic of loans, and this goes into student loans as well as mortgages. The third chapter talks about saving and investing, and the final chapter is about budgeting. And so these are the different elements of financial habits that people need in their life, because many people don't want to learn about finance to a very extensive extent. Maybe they just want to have that basis of understanding so that they can be literate in their own life. And so my resource is dedicated to facilitating that so that people know about the basic concepts, but if they want to learn more, then they can continue their education further on from there.
That's awesome. Yeah. And, I feel like we really need to emphasize the importance of learning financial literacy early on. And it's exciting to hear that there are changes. Like I know in the YRDSP, like kids in grade 3 are starting to learn about the different types of taxes. And, it's just awesome to see that kids are starting to learn this early on. So one of the topics you talked about in your book is credit cards, right? And in today's world, credit cards are a necessary convenience. And I think sometimes we do tend to abuse them. But what type of credit cards do you recommend for high school students? Because I know there's a lot and it can get very overwhelming for students and youth to choose a specific one. And then if you could also touch on what is credit score and why is it so important to build a solid credit score?
Yeah, for sure. So a lot of points to cover there. I think firstly, as with the types of credit cards, there isn't like one specific one that I would say like this is perfect, you should get this, but there are generally 3 different types. So there is student credit cards, which are for college students and people who are attending university. And then there's secured and unsecured. And so when high school students want to get a credit card and they're under 18, that's actually possible. And a lot of people don't know this. And this is when you do it with a co-signer through your parents. And so you're able to build your credit score through your parents if they're okay with doing that. And so secured credit cards have a limit and you make a specific deposit. Let's say you make $200 of a deposit and you can borrow up to those $200. And typically people who don't have a credit score, so let's say you're starting your own independent credit card from 18 and you don't have any past history, then people typically start out with that. And if they're responsible with it over time, then they upgrade to an unsecured credit card for which you don't have to put a deposit. And so the difference is that if you have a secured credit card and you don't make the payment at a certain point, they can take that deposited money from you to pay back what you've borrowed and didn't pay back. But unsecured credit cards don't have anything deposited, and so they're not able to take that money back. And so I feel like credit cards can sometimes get a bad reputation in our society because if you do abuse them, you're going to go into a lot of debt, and credit cards have very high interest rates, which may take years to pay off. But if you use it responsibly, it's a very important tool that helps you build up your credit score, which is then important when you're applying for loans, such as if you want to buy a house and you need a mortgage, they're going to check that credit score because it gives them an indication of whether you've been responsible with your finances in the past. And so there are different components that make up that credit score. And the different ones are things such as payment history. So have you been consistent with paying your bills on time, on or before the due date over a set period of time? They factor in how many credit cards you have. They factor in hard inquiries. So if you're constantly applying for loans or constantly applying for credit cards, that is going to decrease your score up to a certain period of time. There's also credit utilization. So let's say there's $500 available to you and you're maxing that out every single month, that is going to negatively impact you. So these are the different factors that come into play, as well as how long you've had the credit cards. Because one thing is, and this is why it's so important to start early, being in high school or when you're 18, because if someone is going to the bank and they want to give a mortgage to 2 different people, one of them who has had a credit card for 6 months versus someone who's had it for 6 years, if this person, the first person, has been paying it off on time consistently, they're still going to have a lower credit score because the other person, 6 years, it's a much more extensive time period. And so it's much more evident that they've been responsible with their money over a longer period of time. And that's why it's so important to start early and start responsibly. And that just kind of comes into the factor of learning how to use credit cards in high school, because then once you get it when you're 18, or once you get it when you're in high school, you already have that knowledge of how to be responsible with it and how to spend it in a way that's not going to hurt you and get you into debt or decrease your credit score and have you have to like work up to fix that again.
Wow, that was a lot of information right there. So let's transition into budgeting and saving. So, I'm imagining a grade 11 student, for example. They want to enjoy their time, they want to hang out with friends and go to the movies, but they're also thinking of, saving up for post-secondary. So what are some budgeting and saving tips that you recommend for high school students specifically? So I know a popular one is the 50-30-20 rule. 50% goes to your needs, 30% to wants, and 20% to investments and savings. So do you recommend that? Is that a good rule of thumb? And are there any other rules that you'd recommend?
So I think that that is a good way to start off because it gives you a baseline understanding of how to approach it. But I don't think that it's something that's rigid, like you have to invest like 20% or you have to spend 50% to your needs, because I think that especially with high school students, a big portion of their needs is being covered by their family. And so maybe they can dedicate a much bigger portion to spending on investing or saving. So it's definitely something that can be adjusted based on people's own goals. And so I think if someone wants to begin saving and investing and budgeting, an important component is determining what their goals are and why they want to be financially responsible. Because if people say, okay, I need to be financially responsible because people say it's important, that's not a good enough reason that's going to motivate them. But if they have a specific goal and they're like, okay, maybe I want to go to a concert like 6 months from now and I want to save up for that, like because they're motivated by that goal, they're going to want to be consistent with their habits. And over that time of reaching what they want to reach, they're not only learning to save and invest, but they're building those habits, which are really important, whether it be saving for something that's quite small or quite large. And so I think that it's important to firstly determine what your goal is. So if people want to save, let's say for post-secondary education, that is going to be the driving factor. And from there, they kind of think about, okay, how much is it going to be, like, how much is it going to cost, like an estimate, dividing that up, thinking of how much they can save on a monthly basis and how much money they're making now if they are making money. And so kind of breaking that down with their own financial situation. And it doesn't have to be such a large goal like post-secondary education. It can be anything that they want to achieve that's in the future, whether it be like short-term or longer term.
Mm-hmm. And for students who are specifically looking into saving for post-secondary, what sort of tips would you give them?
I think that for that, an important part is, of course, finding a source of income. So you're able to rely on that to be able to divide it. And after that, I think that if they want to save for post-secondary, a bigger portion of what they're saving should go specifically towards that. So for instance, when there's like the 50-30-20 rule, maybe you want to dedicate 40% to saving for college instead, because again, they're not going to have those needs as much as someone who's living on their own, is independent. And so they can dedicate a bigger portion to that. And likewise, once they're able to attend post-secondary education or receive post-secondary education, they can adjust that again to think about how they want to approach that. So being able to make that as big of a part of their budget as they can so that they can reduce the amount of student loan debt that they're going to go into, because after they graduate, it is going to take a big part of their budget if they're not, if they are going into a lot of debt.
Mm-hmm. Now, all these words we're talking about, like there's so many different buzzwords when it comes to financial literacy, like tax credits and crypto and Dogecoin and credit scores. And it often makes teens very intimidated and overwhelmed to even start learning about financial literacy. And it's often the reason why kids don't get into it, start learning it at a very young age. So how can we make money management and financial literacy more exciting for teens and, really make them more motivated to learn about this?
Yeah, that's a really good question because that's kind of something that I was thinking about when I was like writing my book as well. And so at the beginning of every chapter of my book, I have a whole sheet where I like list a lot of key definitions that you need to know to understand the chapter. And that was my goal, to kind of break down that jargon and make it like not as intimidating. And that's something that I heard people enjoyed from the book and the feedback. And so I think really breaking that down and providing this education makes people less intimidated, because I feel like when you don't know about something, you're much less likely to trust it. Like if you don't know too much about investing, you're gonna not want to like go towards that route or invest. But when you have an understanding, you're more confident. And so you're more likely to want to make those financial decisions. And so I think that it can be delivered in a lot of different ways. And I think what we do with like my organization, Empower Econ, which hosts virtual financial education camps, um, an important component is that we bring in a lot of different things that people can do. So we have our presentations, we have our guest speakers, and finally we have our simulations and activities. And I think that simulation and activity aspect is really important because they're basically playing a game related to finance, but they're making real life decisions and they're applying the knowledge that they learn in the real world. And so not only is that kind of an exciting way to teach finance, but it also puts people in that position to make those decisions, which increases their confidence in their own abilities and the knowledge that they have. And so it's not just sitting in a classroom, hearing a teacher talk about it. It's not just reading a book, but it's taking that knowledge and actually making decisions with it. And I think that simulation aspect is definitely something that should be incorporated into, for instance, a curriculum that's taught in school or in any other setting.
Yeah, I think simulations are really fun. And I know a really popular game that a lot of high school and students in general use are stock market simulation. So they buy stocks and they play around, but it's just simulation and no real money is involved. And I think it's a really great way to get started into, if kids are interested in learning about investing.
I'd like to switch over to more on the parenting. How can we parent, and also compare multiple generations and how money was taught to multiple generations. So my first question is for the millennial generation, right? So the millennial generation, it says that 45% of millennials have student loan debt. How can we change this whole trend of starting off your life with so much debt? How can Gen Zs prepare themselves and be in a better state so that they don't start off with a huge student loan debt before they get into the corporate world or the business world?
Yeah, that's a great question, because I feel like the student loan crisis is definitely something that's a very big topic. And I talk with a lot of college students who've talked about this challenge that they faced. And so I think this just kind of one aspect of it comes back to the importance of this education, because when people have this understanding of how student loans, like how much you're going to take out and how much it's going to impact your life, they're much more likely to make decisions beforehand that can really impact the trajectory of their lives. And so with Empower Econ, my organization's events, once we taught about student loans, and I found that the audience was really surprised at how some student loans may take 5-10 years to pay off. They just didn't think that it was going to be such a big part of their life. And after learning about that, they were quite taken aback. And so I think when we provide that education, people are aware of what they're getting themselves into, because I feel like college is typically this cycle where people say, okay, I've graduated high school, now I have to go to college because it's the norm, and I'm going to come out and have like a set amount of income and my life is going to be that straight path. But the reality is that there is a correlation between the college that they attend, the major that they study, the income that they have after graduation, and being able to have just an understanding of that and seeing like, okay, I'm going into $40,000 of debt, but my like starting salary is going to be $20,000, and kind of thinking about like, how can I make decisions now that is going to change that? So I think one important aspect is doing as well as you can in school so that you can apply for many scholarships, because scholarships, I've seen a lot of people are basically able to fund their entire education with scholarships sometimes. So I think that's a really important component. And a lot of college students say, like, if I knew how much debt I was going to be in, I would have definitely applied for more scholarships. So I think that's one important aspect. Then making decisions based on like where you want to attend college, what you want to study, really considering those in the context of your financial situation, and having that knowledge and being able to prevent the amount of debt as much as you can. And I think another important aspect is that sometimes, like governments can provide a a lot more financial aid than people actually need. And so making sure not to take all of that money out just because it's provided to you, because a lot of people do end up doing that and afterwards realize that they didn't really need to take that out. And now they're in a lot more debt than they could have been. So I think those are important tips to keep in mind.
It leads me to my next question, because I do talk to university students and even students who've graduated university. And one of the things that comes about is the whole scarcity mindset mentality, right? I can't afford to go to this university, so therefore I'm going to settle. And even though if I get accepted by this great university, I can't afford it, they're not funding me, hence I will choose an alternative, which is not my first option. Is there a way to move from that scarcity mindset? Are there a few tips that you can share in regards to that, to an abundance mindset?
Yeah, definitely. I feel like one thing about that college scenario specifically is that some of the colleges that are quite expensive actually end up giving the most financial aid and scholarships if you are accepted. So I think that's something important to keep in mind. And I think that just kind of evaluating things in the context of your own life and seeing the amount of value that it will provide for yourself, because there isn't a specific answer of saying like, yes, you should go to college or no, you shouldn't. The costs and benefits really depend on your own life. And so being able to make those decisions based on like, what do you want to study? How much is your expected salary going to be? What your family's financial situation is, as opposed to simply writing off a college simply because of its price. So I think that just considering both the qualitative and quantitative factors together. And I think that transitioning to that abundance mindset is definitely something that takes a lot of work for people.
What are your thoughts about investments? So if we were to teach kids on how to invest safely, so you mentioned, simulators as one option. Are there other options where they can truly invest and see a return on investment in something for a 12-year-old, for a 20-year-old, for a 25-year-old, if you can give it for those age ranges?
Yeah, so I do have a few things in mind. The first is that my organization, Empower Econ, recently partnered with a really interesting initiative. They're called Bumper, and they're actually an investment platform for teens. And so what high school students can do on that platform is they go on there and they start investing in index funds and in stocks. And as they're going along, the platform teaches them about that investing process. So it teaches them about what they're doing. It teaches them about how the investment works. And that's really a good way to have people actually invest and be able to learn along the process. And for people there, I know that they're sponsoring a lot of financial education events. And so with our events, people who attend are able to receive a small amount of starting money where they are able to actually begin investing. And I think another way to invest is using brokerage accounts. So what people can do is they can get a custodial brokerage account with their parents' name. And what they can do with that is start investing and putting investments into that platform. And it's quite an easy way to begin investing because it's linked with their parents and they can put securities into it. They can buy and sell. And they can also use apps that are well known, such as Robinhood, for investing.
So how do we parent Gen Zs in regards to money mindset? One of the things that, well, I've heard my parents say, and sometimes I hear people of my age telling their kids, money doesn't grow on trees, or do you really think we can afford that? Now, having conversations like that, how is having, in your opinion, do you think that's a negative way of having conversations with your children? And if so, then what is a suggested way of having conversations with your children about money?
Yeah, I do think that's a relatively negative way because I feel like a lot of times talking about money can be taboo in households. People say like, you're too young to think about this right now, or it doesn't matter. So I think that instead of saying, oh, this is like too expensive, or using common phrases like that, maybe giving like, if like a person is quite young, like giving them an allowance and teaching them how to save and invest for something. Or if they say that I want something and it's too expensive and the parent doesn't want to pay for it, telling them like you can achieve it if you're able to set up a budget and work towards it and save your money. And so through that, they're able to learn the value of money, but they're also able to develop those habits of setting a goal, creating a budget for it, and being consistent with it until they're able to reach that goal. So I think telling them, like, instead of telling them, oh, it's not possible, telling them like you can make it happen, it requires work and a responsible mindset when it comes to money.
And any sort of dinner conversations that we can have in regards to improving money conversations and openness with families to talk about money and their money situation. So as an example, if a parent lost their job, how does that impact the money or the finances? Do we have to worry about it? Those kind of conversations, how can a parent have those kind of conversations? What sort of language could we use with our kids to encourage them to understand that, yeah, we have savings, yeah, we can manage crisis moments like this? So what sort of language could we use around that?
Yeah, that's definitely a really good question, because I think that involving young people in those situations can definitely be a really great learning experience. So I think that, let's say a parent has lost their job, instead of kind of talking about it in a very pessimistic way and complaining, maybe using it as an opportunity to teach their kid about the importance of having an emergency fund and being able to save up for that in case something like this happens, so that you're anticipating things that may go wrong, even though they have not, so that you're able to save up that kind of like money in case something does go wrong. So having those conversations and teaching them like, this is not a crisis if you're able to plan for it ahead of time and make decisions that are going to help you and benefit you in the future. And so using that as an opportunity to tell them about the importance of saving and emergency funds.
Awesome. Yeah, it would be great to have dinner conversations like that. What programs do you recommend Gen Zs or to parents to enroll their kids other than your programs? Are there, well, first of all, if you can talk through your programs, and also if you can talk about other programs that are out there, specifically in Canada or even online, that Gen Zs can apply for to understand more about and more fun ways of learning about money.
Yeah, for sure. So as for my own initiative, Empower Econ, what we do is we host like 3-day financial education events. Whereas I touched on briefly earlier, people come in, it's like from a lot of different countries, and they're able to learn about a lot of different topics. So we cover things like creating different streams of income, building credit, developing budgets, long-term financial goals, real estate investing, and all of that. So we do that through guest speakers, lessons, activities. And I think as for other resources, I know there are other organizations. There is one called the Teen Trillionaire, and what they do is they host financial education events as well as like entrepreneurship events where people are able to like start their own business or something along the lines of that. And that helps them like think about the entrepreneurial aspects and the finance that's incorporated into that. I remember last time when I talked with Thanuja, she also mentioned this platform by McGill University, which provides personal finance resources online. So I looked at that and I think that's amazing. Totally would recommend that. And I think that for me, how I learned about finance was through a lot of different platforms. So one YouTube channel that I really enjoyed learning from was Graham Stephan, because he puts a lot of really great content and it's very like digestible and entertaining. So people not only learn, but he's very humorous and people have a lot of fun. And I know that a lot of people really love his channel. So especially for people who are beginners and they really want to learn about it for like content that's catered more towards millennials and Gen Z, I think that's definitely a great platform to go to, as well as Investopedia articles, which I really enjoy reading because they also break down the content and make it really comprehensible. So those are some of the platforms that I would recommend. Another one that's specifically for economics is Common Sense Economics. And I know that a lot of people had their introduction to economics from there. So definitely a wide range of resources.
And are there any podcasts that you follow as well? I know you mentioned the YouTube channel, but is there any podcasts that you suggest?
Yeah, so there are 3 that I really like. One of them is Better Wealth, and it's by a financial company. The next one is Next Gen Personal Finance, and this is by a nonprofit organization, a very big organization in the United States for financial education. And the third one is by, it's called So Money, and it's by Farnoosh Torabi, and she's also a financial expert. And so I really enjoy listening to her podcast as well, and she covers a very wide range of topics. So those are my main 3 favorites.
And do you have any suggestions for books?
Yeah, I think that for books, there are like a lot of the very classic ones that people really enjoy, like Rich Dad Poor Dad and Think and Grow Rich. I would also recommend Secrets of the Millionaire Mind, which I think is quite an interesting topic. And there is another book by a high school student that I recently came across. I can't remember the name specifically. Oh, I think it's called Gen Z Money Sense, and it's quite a lengthy book and it's very interesting. So I would recommend that as well.
Awesome. Well, I mean, Armita, you've covered a lot about money, and I was just wondering if you can tell our audience how they can connect with you, and if you can also say again your book's name and how they can get access to that if they're interested.
Yeah, for sure. So my book is called Roadmap to Financial Literacy: An Introduction to Personal Finance for Teenagers, and that can be found on Amazon. As for reaching out to me, you can find my organization at empowerecon.com on the internet. That's the website. And you can also reach out to me on LinkedIn, Armita Hosseini, and my email is armitahj@gmail.com.
Thank you so much for your time, Armita. I really appreciate it. Tanaja and me, I'm sure we've learned so much about money. I personally felt like I learned much more and wish, like I mentioned in the start, wish I had this information at a young age. But hey, no age, really, we can learn at every age. And I've learned so much from you. So thank you so much, Armita, for coming on today at Gen Z Talks. And I look forward to staying connected with you.
Yeah, for sure. Thank you so much for having me. And it was a pleasure talking with you. So yeah, thank you.